was in 7th grade, we were having a lot of construction done to our house. So it was me, my parents, my brother, my sister, and we actually had my cousin who was living with us at the time too. And because we were doing so much construction to the house, like we were adding a second floor, redoing most of the house, we ended up getting a trailer that we put like in our backyard, like on our property, that we lived out of. And to be honest, I don't remember how long it was for. I want to say it was, I don't know, let's call it 3 to 4 months. It may have been slightly less. It may have been a little bit longer. But it was a small trailer. I think it was 2 bedrooms. So my parents had a bedroom. Me, my brother, and my sister shared a bedroom. And then my cousin actually slept in the den, living room, whatever that area, like the living area. There was a couch with a bed. And I remember it was boring. I think there was one TV in the whole trailer, so you didn't have a lot of access to that, and there just wasn't a lot of space for yourself. There wasn't a lot of room to do the things you wanted to do. It was in our backyard, and if I recall correctly, it was in the winter, so like playing outside there wasn't much of that going on. So anyway, I say all that because during that time period, I was looking for something to do, and I remember reading my U.S. history book. So 7th grade, so I was taking U.S. history, and we had the textbook, and I was bored, and there was nothing to do. So I remember just reading it. Like I read straight through. I think it was during the school year, obviously, so we were a third of the way through the book, and I just finished the whole thing. And I can still remember reading it in that room and reading through different parts of our history and, getting to, through the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812 and the Spanish-American War and just, different things that happened. And then the Louisiana Purchase and as we expanded the country and started to develop further. And then obviously getting into the 20th century and a lot around World War II, but the Great Depression and the, just all different things, right? All the things in history. And I remember reading it a bit like a novel. I knew the ending. I knew America did well, but to be able to read through it and see the specifics was exciting. And it was exciting because I knew we won, right? So there was no danger in it. My team won, and now I just got to kind of read the news of it. And it's funny, I compare it to, I've talked about it in other videos, when my sports team wins or somebody in sports that I'm rooting for wins, I'll typically stay up for hours and watch the post-game press conference, and watch the interviews and watch them talk about it because I just love hearing about it. I mean, it's great, right? My team won. And it was kind of a similar mindset in 7th grade when I was reading that book. Like, this is great. This is great to see the details. And, there was a lot of pride too. So when I was in 7th grade, what year was that? It had to be like mid-90s, 94, 95. So, always issues in the world, but growing up the way I did and at the time that I did, there was still a lot of pride in America. There was still a strong sense of American exceptionalism. We weren't that far removed from World War II and the Cold War, in which we really, vaulted into the status we've been. So there's a lot of pride. And again, you read a textbook, you think about what I was reading. I was reading a textbook, which nowadays you think about, and there's lots of controversy around that maybe. Who wrote the textbook? Which information did they decide to include? Who did they leave out? What facts about America did they leave out? All that stuff. But at the time, it was pretty good. And, I think about that often because I think about the mindset I had as a 7th grader reading that book. And then I think about today and how I feel, and I think about how others in society feel, right? And my first reaction when I think about it is like, oh shit, like there was a lot of stuff that wasn't in that book. Naturally you can't fit everything, but there was a lot of stuff, some good for sure, right? But a lot of bad that wasn't really focused on, or just issues that were glossed over, where now today I see them as much more prominent. I mean, don't get me wrong, I remember reading about the Civil War and reading about it very, I guess, pridefully and enthusiastically because I knew the Union won and I knew Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. So that was exciting because that was good. The good side won. I remember reading about Jim Crow and Reconstruction and how terrible it was, right? But there was that next step in the book. There was Martin Luther King, and there was, the civil rights movement, and things were more or less corrected there. So as you kind of go through, even you can think about the Revolutionary War. I remember reading it, and as you're reading it in the textbook, there's times in which it's like, hey, we might lose, we're not doing so well, but you knew we were going to win, right? So it's not as if, anything was completely ignored, but just the perspective on it today, right? The perspective I have now to think back through that 7th grade history book. I wish I could find it, actually. Maybe I'll try that someday. But to think back on having read that and the way I took it in and the way I consumed it and what I thought about America, it was an incomplete picture. It was an incomplete perspective. So I can understand the sentiment that a lot of people have today, where they feel like the history is nonsense, right? It's almost, if you're building a data model, what'll often happen when you're doing these types of things is you could build this super robust, comprehensive, complicated model. But if somebody's reviewing it and they see an error, right, in the output table or whatever it is, or in some part of it, now the whole thing's called into question. And for a lot of people, they might say, throw the whole thing out. How do I trust any of it now? You got this whole complicated model, but I see there's a mistake. The whole thing could be wrong, throw it out. So I get that mindset that I think some people have today. And there's more emotion to it, right? That's kind of just a practical, logical mindset. But when you add the emotion into it of people that have been oppressed and people that have been hurt and the people that have been intentionally removed from history or not really given credit, I get it. I get the idea of feeling like, hey, burn this whole thing down and this whole history story that we tell ourselves, and let's actually rebuild it the right way, or let's just ignore it altogether because it's all nonsense. And the idea that there's so much that's missed that kids are learning in school, and it leads you to this belief of like, hey, we shouldn't be that proud of America, right? It's not like we thought in that 7th grade history book. There's way more flaws. There's way more issues today, historically, throughout, right? The stories we read, they were stories. And I guess I take an approach to that mindset as I do most things. I don't like to play in extremes. I don't like to jump to a viewpoint and just kind of run with it. I like to try and stay level-headed. So the way I look back on that 7th grade history book is, it's kind of, it's multifaceted. I'm angry. I'm bothered. I'm somewhat confused, I guess would be right, of like, hey, what's real here and what's not? I really start looking back and thinking through history, and angry that so many things have been neglected or not accounted for, right? You take Thomas Jefferson is just the first example that comes to mind. He's kind of a hot button person right now, and the way we learned about him was that he was a hero, and in many ways he was. A lot of the things he did were amazing, and you can't dismiss that. But he was a slave owner, and he did write the Declaration of Independence declaring that all men are created equal, knowing full well that, there was a huge portion of our population and women, you can include that too, but slaves as well, that were not treated freely. And I get it, the time was different and all those things, but there is a certain responsibility to try and be better. Right? So it's okay to question that, and it's okay to address that. Like we should bring that up and talk about it more. I think historically the view was, well, that's not important, right? The time, that's the way everybody thought. He was a good man, so we don't need to talk about that. Like, leave that aside. It's going to take away from him being a good man. Well, yeah, and it should. It should, because we should have an honest conversation. And he, like everybody else I know of in the world, is complicated and does have multifacets to them and does have good things and bad things. So by not teaching it, we're actually not doing him justice. We're doing him a disservice in his legacy, because to truly understand him, to truly learn from him and try and be better, we need to understand the full picture of him. So I get the idea of wanting to cancel Thomas Jefferson, perhaps, or wanting to erase that part of history, at least not give it as much weighting as it's had historically. And maybe we should reevaluate the weighting, considering some of the other things that are at play. But with that anger, that confusion and all that, there is still pride there. I mean, I think that's okay. I remember a lot of the things I read in that 7th grade textbook, and I think of some of the stories around American history, and there were a lot of amazing things that we've done as a country. And much like we talk about within our own minds, right? Think about cognitive dissonance, this idea that two opposing things can't exist in our mind, right? You can't handle it. But the more sophisticated intellectually you get, the more ability you have to handle that. I think the same applies for a country or a person, but let's talk about a country in this case. It can be true that amazing things were done, but also bad things and horrible things. It could be true that there were amazing people and leaders and heroes who also did some bad things, or at least were implicit or complicit in some bad things. And to me, that's the takeaway. The takeaway is don't burn that 7th grade history book, but also don't make it Bible, right? Don't make it that anything in there should never be changed. That's not what this is about, right? The goal is objective truth. So you look back at that 7th grade history book and you see what's relevant. You see what can be taken from it, and you enhance it and you improve it. And you try and get more to the truth, and you try and get more to the conversations and the discussions that will help us move forward as a society and as a people. So I get it. Some might say that this is, another kind of middle ground view, kind of in between. But again, maybe that's the idea. Maybe that's the point, right? Those that are rushing to defend American history and all aspects of it, much like the speech Trump gave, at Mount Rushmore the other night, they don't seem to fully get the full picture. That like, hey, you have to acknowledge some of these things we did that were bad. And maybe it's worth having the conversation about everybody and just kind of understanding what we know and what we don't know and what's good and what's bad. And that's okay, because there's still going to be a lot of amazing things that come out of it. You don't have to be afraid of that. And likewise, the people on the other side who say, burn it all, get rid of it all. If there's any trace of anybody that did anything that might be a bad thing, then we're disgusted and embarrassed by America as a country, and we need to create something new. Likewise, right? Like, hey, let's pump the brakes a little bit. Like, without a doubt, I want to make sure I understand what mistakes were made in the past and what flaws people had and how we can improve upon them. And I want to make sure we get it right. And if there's people that did some bad things, let's acknowledge that. But that doesn't mean you have to scrap it all. It doesn't mean America didn't do some amazing things. Let's, as a country, be intellectually sophisticated enough to understand that and to appreciate that and have a good, honest conversation about what we want to continue to perpetuate and teach, our children and our youth, etc. And what are the things that we want to change? And what are the things that we think needs a clearer picture and a better picture of it? And the way we're going to get to that better place is diversified views, differences in thoughts and views and opinions on history coming together and trying to piece together what we think is most valuable. Because if any one group tries to dominate and say this is what history is, well, in many ways, you probably have my 7th grade history book all over again, just different facts, different perspective, different viewpoint, but still as slanted. Let's try and get it right. Let's try and be honest about what it is.